all-encompassing system that monopolizes imagination and that monopolizes technology and that will not permit anything to be imagined outside of the zone of the totalism. And after a while, the totalism comes to be accepted as normative and unquestioned. So my thought that I want to share with you is that Christian ministry now takes place in a U.S. totalism that is defined by a consumer standard of living that cannot be sustained, by a strong military that is necessary to sustain that standard of living, that is legitimated by a religious notion of U.S. exceptionalism that propels market ideology. And you might want to give different nuance to that, but I think that's the totalism in which we live, that it is normative and unquestioned among us, and all of us who are conservatives and all of us who are liberals roughly are committed to that. And the totalism regularly works at silencing anyone who imagines anything outside the totalism. The best case I can think of for silencing is in Amos 7, where Amaziah, the priest at Bethel, says to Amos, go do your prophetic ministry in the south. You cannot do it here because this is the king's chapel, and nobody can talk that way in the king's chapel. And I don't know how you experience it, but my experience is that the force of silencing is very powerful and is faced by ministers who know about how much they can say and how much they dare not say. And in white congregations that I know, you can do all kinds of critical work on the Bible and on the gospel, but you cannot say too much about market ideology and the normative economic practice that is among us. So I thought it might be useful for white and black clergy to reflect on the totalism, because my suspicion is that black and white clergy experience the totalism in very different kinds of ways, but all experience the totalism. So the challenge of ministry is to penetrate the edges of that totalism with what I call a voice from elsewhere. The important thing about the gospel voice, Jewish or Christian, the good news voice about God's governance of the world, is that it does not come from inside the totalism, and it cannot be contained within the totalism. It comes from elsewhere, and among Israel's ancient prophets, the formula for signaling that the voice is from elsewhere is, "Thus saith the Lord." That's a very cagey formula that cannot be verified. Nobody knows whether anybody has got a word from elsewhere. But it really is the case that ministers who get up and talk the faith are indeed bearing witness to claims that are from outside the totalism, which I think is why the utterance of truth in our society is so problematic, because very many people with whom we minister are inured to the totalism and do not want utterance from elsewhere. So as I think about Israel's ancient prophets, and you know their themes are judgment and hope, I've been working on those themes, thinking about those themes, because you can't really talk about divine judgment in the totalism. So I think the way divine judgment might be talked about inside the totalism is to ask, what are the non-transgressible limits in God's world? And if you look at the Decalogue, the absolutism of thou shalt not, thou shalt not, thou shalt not, is an enumeration of limits in God's purpose that simply cannot be transgressed. So the question for the religious community is, what are those limits? Are there limits to poverty? Are there limits to police abuse? Are there limits to homelessness? Are there limits to torture? All of those things are legitimated in the totalism. They're all right. They're the cost of doing business. And the voice from outside says otherwise. The second theme of hope, it's very hard to talk about hope because, in fact, the totalism does not want anything new. So if you look at the political rhetoric to which we are now being subjected, it's all a look backward. It's all about the restoration of what used to be, which will never happen. So the question is, how does the voice of totalism, the voice from outside totalism, speak hope? And I suggest that it is identifying in quite local ways the originary stirrings of God's Spirit. I worked hard on that word, originary. Every time I write it in a manuscript, some copy editor changes it to original. And I write back and said, if I wanted to say original, I would have said original. I said originary. By originary, I mean generating something that was not. So this sort of a meeting of conversations across all of our barriers is potentially an originary stirring of God's Spirit. Who knows what might come? Or the new food movements are an originary stirring of the Spirit that means to break the back of agribusiness, etc., etc., etc. Most of the originary stirrings of God's Spirit are quite local. They're not big movements. And it is the work of ministry to spot those stirrings and to authorize them and to notice them. So I think that if our ministry is based outside the totalism, then to do judgment as non-transgressible limits that have become normative in the totalism, and as originary stirrings of the Spirit when the totalism believes that the Spirit has no more stirring to do because we contain everything already. I think the book of Acts is a script of the originary stirrings of the Spirit in which the apostles are endlessly moved by the Spirit. And as I said to maybe some of you last night, I think the extraordinary thing in the book of Acts that we've missed often is that the apostles stirred by the Spirit were regularly called in by the Roman magistrates to give an account of their weirdness, because weirdness makes the totalism very nervous. Final observation I have is that this maintenance and practice of a voice from elsewhere is hard, dangerous work, and it takes a community from elsewhere that has many gifts. So the notion of the solo minister who will wing it is not workable because the force of the totalism is too powerful. So what we are here about today, perhaps, is to find each other and to find among us gifts that we have to have together, and it requires a community of great diversity to sustain that voice from elsewhere. So I've given you a set of questions to reflect on, and if these questions are not interesting to you, then just get to know your neighbor. I've been in many small groups, and small groups tend to do what they want to do, if anything. But these are the questions. How do you experience the totalism? How do you experience the silencing? How do you find a place to stand outside the totalism? Where would you stand outside the totalism? What gifts do you bring to that community from outside the totalism? And what gifts do you not have that you observe other people having that you need? So the conversation might just be about how do we receive gifts from each other. So what I want you to do is to scoot your chair back and be in groups of not more than 3. And hopefully there'll at least be one other person in your group of 3 that you don't know. And see what you make of these questions, and have some ease and some freedom about how you use the time. I think the more specific and concrete your reflection is, the more useful it will be to your neighbors, because I think white clergy need to know how this is experienced by black clergy and vice versa. The rule of this totalism is that you cannot be with 2 people that you know well. You have about a half hour.
Well, thank you all so much, Dr. Brueggemann. We're so glad that you're here. Let's welcome him back up as he concludes our session today.
I just have a couple comments. The first one is, and I think we were right at it with Keith, people of faith need to be taught how to do social analysis. And my experience is that white people in white churches are mightily resistant to doing social analysis. Upton Sinclair said it's very hard to get a man to learn something new if his learning it will cause him to lose his job. It is very difficult to get people. It is very difficult to get people to do social analysis if that awareness puts their advantage in question. But if we do not learn to do social analysis, we just don't notice things, and we cannot see what's going on. And I think that pastors have an obligation to give people the tools to do social analysis. So I have a puckish suggestion. Many churches, when they read Scripture, say, the word of the Lord, thanks be to God. Episcopalians say, praise to you, Lord Christ. And I have observed that in the churches where I go, almost nobody listens to Scripture. So instead of saying, praise to you, Lord Christ, just say, it's the money, stupid. And the congregation will say, thanks be to God. It is the money, stupid. Social analysis can be done. It can be done in the categories of biblical faith. The other observation I have is that no totalism contains within it the juices of life. Totalisms left to themselves are lethal. And therefore, a word from outside the totalism is indispensable. So the totalism of capitalist white supremacy in Memphis is lethal, and it cannot be sustained without a word from outside. Now, the reason I'm saying it that way is that I believe that the future of Memphis, like the future of Cincinnati where I live, depends upon the bold witness of the religious community that keeps reminding us about the limits that cannot be transgressed and about the ordinary possibilities that are bubbling up every day. And if there are not voices and practices to energize those juices, the city will eventually turn on itself in self-destruction, which is to say that your common witness matters decisively to the health of the city. And I think what David said about meeting regularly is exactly right. I understand that everybody has got a full-time job and more. But I propose that you think seriously about redeploying some small part of your energy and time for this collegium. It could matter to the health of the city.